All right, so I'm going to get started with welcoming everyone here today. Good afternoon, good evening to you on those of you on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us for the Student Association of Fire Ecology's Connection webinar series. My name is Matt Behrens. I'm a master's student at Northern Arizona University, where I'm studying prescribed fire at Denali National Park. I'm also a member of the outgoing National Safe Leadership Team who assisted with planning this webinar series, and I'm going to be the host for today's webinar. This is the last of 6 webinars that the Student Association for Fire Ecology has hosted this academic year. And our intent for these webinars really has been to create a forum for students and early career fire ecologists to hear from a diverse group of influential professionals and engage in discussion with these guest speakers and other attendees. So I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us and to convey to you that you are in the right place. These webinars are for you. It's up to all of us as participants to make these webinars and discussions what we want out of them. So I encourage you to engage, listen, take away what you can. Before I introduce today's speaker, let's go over a quick couple of housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the SAFE website. We're going to end the recording at the end of Dr. Adams' presentation, at which point we will have a Q&A that will not be recorded. So please feel free to add any questions you have to the chat throughout the presentation. And Dr. Adams can let us know if she's going to take questions during presentation or if we'll just wait, and I'll be moderating throughout. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Melinda Adams. Dr. Adams is a member of the ND San Carlos Apache tribe and is an assistant professor at the University of Kansas. She's a cultural fire practitioner and scholar, and her research focuses on the revitalization of cultural fire with tribes in California and also in the Midwest. Her work with indigenous communities lives at the nexus of ecology and environmental science, environmental policy, and indigenous studies methodologies. As a fire scholar, Dr. Adams concentrates on encouraging public participation in prescribed and controlled burns and getting more people fire certified, placing more indigenous-led cultural fire on the ground with allies, agencies, and tribal members, what she describes as decolonizing fire. So thank you, Dr. Adams, for joining us today. With that, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Hannah and Andrew, for organizing this session. I appreciate the invitation to be here with you all. I do have a Menti. If folks have used Menti before, it's a polling platform. There's just one simple question to ask that we'll get through after I share a little bit about some background, just a heads up. So for me, I would say Dagote, she Melinda Adams, Honchle. That's how we say hello in my language, San Carlos Apache, located in what is now known as Arizona. I actually belong to 2 Arizona tribes, San Carlos from my mother and Tohono O'odham from my father. I went to school at a tribal college in Lawrence, Kansas, which is why it brings me back to Kansas as a professor. And I'll share with you, it's one of 37 institutions, universities that awards baccalaureate degrees to Indigenous students. So it's one of only 30 tribal colleges, universities that are specifically for Indigenous peoples. So that's how I say hello. And what you're looking at and what I'll talk about is cultural fire. So this was part of a 2022, one of the first partnerships of Indigenous peoples with CAL FIRE, the state fire agency that controls or manages wildfire mitigation and prescribed burning. So this is one of the very first partnerships between CAL FIRE and Indigenous peoples, and a cultural fire demonstration at the Tending and Gathering Garden, which is part of the Cache Creek Nature Preserve located in Woodland, California. QR code at the bottom links to some of the papers and research initiatives that Matt shared earlier. So if you're interested in kind of teetering off and learning about that now, the QR code will be embedded throughout the presentation. All right. So I hope you all are familiar with Menti. So what you do is you go to menti.com, and you can do this on your phone or on your laptop if you have that pulled up right now. I'm asking you, that way I can help guide or steer this conversation of what are you interested in learning about cultural fire. So certainly you're interested, you signed up for the webinar to learn a little bit or to share. So this would help me kind of gauge our discussion, although I think I have plenty to share through environmental science, ecology, through some policy invocation, and then some Indigenous research methodological tools. Okay, so I see 2 answers so far. I'll give people a minute to get situated with the Menti. Thank you for your patience. And I'm checking the chat too. So if it's easier to throw a response in the chat box, I'll guide back and forth between the 2. Oh, awesome. Thank you all. So how cultural fire is controlled so that it doesn't spread dangerously. It's a great one. Are able to connect with people in the community to participate. Awesome, great. Also great. Smoke management. Yep. Cross-boundary cultural fire management. Yeah, really great interest and inquiries. And with the information that I have to share, I hope it's helpful in moving closer to answering some of these, the ones that can be answered with the status of wildfire as it exists. Policy barriers. Yep, we're definitely going to talk about that, and some data sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty as well. How do tribes support state agencies? Great. So I think we have a wide spectrum of interest, a lot of which I'll cover in this talk. So welcome. Thank you for being here. And if you want to keep trickling in some interests into the Menti, there'll also be an opportunity for Q&A at the very end. Thank you all for your generosity. All right, so here is my story walk through the different vignettes of research and collaborations with tribes in Cultural Fire that I have to offer you today. So people may or may not know my technical background and what brings me to the Cultural Fire work. I partnered with Indigenous nations in what is now known as California for my dissertation doctoral work, but as a work that keeps bringing me back to California to keep up those good relations and those responsibilities that I have with the tribes that were so generous with their time and their knowledge during my journey out there. So I'll talk about the precursor, the technical background that I have and the lens of which I view Cultural Fire, which is an eco-cultural lens. I'll then walk through some of the work I've done with the North Fork Mono tribe and the Putwin Southern Wintu tribe of California. And then I'll wrap up here with the work I'm doing right now in the Great Plains of Midwestern United States, some of the cultural fire revitalization, as well as the data sovereignty and some processes and protocol protections to try to protect fire knowledge as data. Before I came to California to study cultural fire or be in the cultural fire world, I studied terra preta soils, or the recreation of those terra preta soils. So for those that may not know, they're actually presently some of the richest and most fertile soils in the world. They have 70 times up to the level of soil organic matter than surrounding soils. They're small islands of highly sustainable, fertile, dark earth. That's what terra preta translates into. And during my graduate studies, I went to Purdue University. During my graduate studies, what I was finding on biochar, the recreation of terra preta soils, was that they're based off the principles and processes of burning vegetative material and shards in living spaces and Indigenous peoples were present in the Amazon basin. They would purposely burn their lands for soil caretaking. And when I was going to school at the graduate school the first time, it wasn't as acknowledged or credited to Indigenous peoples that these were purposely placed fire for the betterment of their ecosystems. So it's important to me to do the research that I did at Purdue University, acknowledging those terra preta soils were created intentionally through fire care and fire stewardship. These soils, the terra pretas, are found on nutrient-poor oxasols, so tropical soils in the Amazon, more degradative soils than we have, say, here in the United States. Our soils are bad, but there are other soils across the world that have a lot more stratification, which means there's been a lot more movement. There's more tropical influences in other parts of the world comparatively. So I did this biochar research with my advisor, who is in the plant ecology, had a plant ecology lab and a soil science part of his lab. So what we did was we applied applied this updated version of terra preta soils. We burned biomass, biochar, and then integrated it back into the soil profile system to try to regrow tallgrass prairie. Tallgrass prairie is a culturally significant ecosystems to the tribes located in the central part of the United States and several provinces and First Nations Canada. So it's a shared tallgrass prairie ecosystem that stretches from Canada, Midwestern United States, all the way to the top of Mexico. So it's an important ecosystem that through different waves of colonization, land removal of indigenous peoples, large-scale agriculture, large-scale mining, that ecosystem that once blanketed all across the United States and the Midwest is now deduced to less than 1% that remains. So the tribes that I work with now are have high priorities to return those culturally significant plants in that ecosystem that was and continues to be fire dependent as well. So for the biochar research, what I did was I applied this biochar to tallgrass prairie. Because the theory of biochar is, and what people observe in some of their field trials, when applied to agricultural crops, they have a positive effects in yield. So plants do better. They grow taller, they produce more plant parts with the addition of charred material. It also increases the nutrient availability for plant uptake, soil porosity. That's my favorite part. So there's a surface area expansion that happens when changing the soil physical and chemical properties that leads to better water retention, better water encapsulation. So positive effects of this biochar addition to agricultural crops in South and Central America. And so we applied those principles to tallgrass prairie plant species in the Midwest. It's a messy chart, and if we had more time, I would go over this in greater detail, but what you're looking at is called a replacement series, and that's the experiment that I ran on these tallgrass prairie species and the burned charred materials integrated back in. So what you're looking at is what it's saying is the different competitive effects of a native tallgrass species. Right here, it's a grass. It's one of the big three, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass. This is big blue stem. That's our native species that tribes want to see returned. And to the right is Sericea lespedeza. It's an imported plant from Asia that was brought over for erosion control. And it's a wicked competitor. It takes over above ground biomass through canopy cover, and then it also releases allelopathic chemicals in its root structure to ward off native plant species trying to establish. So it competes very well. What you're looking at is no matter what the ratios of plants that I planted to see if there were different competitive effects. Overall, just cutting straight to it, overall, this invasive species, when we added biochar or didn't add biochar to competitive strategies, it still outperformed our native big blue stem, unfortunately. What's interesting about this data when we disaggregate the competitive effects is when we look at how the native plant species over here, the grass, responded to biochar additions compared to no biochar additions, we saw that the plant did better. So biochar increased the growth of our native species. So in essence, what this is saying is burned charcoal material integrated back into the soil profile benefited our native plant species. There's a lot of different reasons why that is. The main one is that these plants were adapted to and continue to be better placed when there's a carbon-rich product that's added to their soil profile for plant uptake, and a carbon-rich product is fire. So what this is signaling is that there's opportunity to study how these plants are going to benefit post-fire. So this was not live fire that I applied to these plant and soil systems. This was the product of fire. But this certainly informs the work that I do with tribes now, which is live fire as an effect of how these plants are going to grow. And significantly, Indigenous-led, traditional ecological, knowledge-informed, lower temperature, lower severity cultural fire is the fire that we apply to these culturally significant plants needing to be revitalized. Okay, so that's the precursor to some of the cultural fire work that I have done out west and that I continue to do with tribes now. The leaders in the world of cultural fire return are those that are living in what is now known as California. So the tribes whose homelands is now California. We know most of them from the Northwest region of California. But nonetheless, being there and learning from a lot of these folks who I will point to in different stages of this presentation because they're doing the great work and have been for decades now. So credit needs to be given to them in these spaces. And I'm not speaking for any tribe or any person. I'm giving you my perspective as a scholar that's worked in this space, as an Indigenous woman that works in cultural fire. That's what this presentation is. But nonetheless, Indigenous peoples have shaped and maintained California ecosystems, including coastal prairies, valley oak savannas, and montane meadows. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with this book, Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson. Some of the ecology that she introduces signaled and referenced Indigenous peoples' role in what's called ecological disturbance. So pruning, coppicing, burning, plant relation, and inactivity. Before this seminal work, it wasn't as much articulated in ecological research or ecological publications. So MCAT Anderson, working closely with several Indigenous nations in California, acknowledged Indigenous peoples' stewarding practices within these ecological disturbance. And another term that she uses is pyrodiversity practices that supported local economies. And most of her work that's cited and recited is on the effects of fire historically on significant basketry materials for tribes in California. And the bottom picture is of, I think that's Elizabeth Jesus. I think it's Elizabeth the Zeus from the Karuk and Yurok tribe, part of the Cultural Fire Management Council and their present cultural fire initiatives. So re-emphasizing fire stewards that are in California, actively reclaiming their fire stewardship practices. Some people know this too. The role of fire removal has left us in California more fire prone because of the absence of fire, being in a fire deficiency in ecosystems and peoples that are fire adapted, fire dependent. And why that happened was legislation that was erected and agencies that formulated themselves as fire suppression. So this legislative piece purposely removed Indigenous peoples from their homelands. There's a little bit of noise in the background. Removed Indigenous peoples from their homelands, therefore removing stewardship practices tied to those homelands and those identities. So fire being one of them, but also how that is related to hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. So because of these policies enacted in 1850 and the continuance of those policies, the amount of lands that our peoples, Indigenous peoples, have access to, we don't have enough access to our original homelands, their original homelands. So these colonial legacies continue. And we're seeing that with the amount of wildfire, gigafire in the spring and summer month season. So cultural fire, as I learn from different tribes and the role of fire within our cultural histories, our oral histories, we're connected, a lot of us, maybe not all of our tribes, but a lot of our tribes are connected by the role of fire as a cultural connection. So some of the it's really hard to define. So some of the definitions that have been offered to me through elders or colleagues. So the first one is from the Chairman, Honorable Chairman Ron Good of the North Fork Mono tribe, how he approaches cultural fire, coding of protection for cultural burning, resource restoration, and land rejuvenation. And another colleague, Dr. Jonathan Long with the U.S. Forest Service, thinks of cultural fire as an ally partnered with Indigenous peoples. Cultural fire promotes intergenerational teachings and active responsibility to the land. So just as our cultures, language, and identities differ from nation to nation, so do our practices and protocols. So these are two examples, but by no means are the complete definition of what cultural fire is. So here's the work that I do. I went over a little bit about the ecology lens. I'm interested in plant and soil responses. But when I came to California, the tribes that I worked with there made sure that I knew about some of the policies that restricts them from having access to their homelands, from stewarding their homelands with fire, and from being involved in any of the post-fire monitoring initiatives. So learning about environmental policy in those prohibitory lens was informative to the work that I did and that I continue to do. Talk a little bit about that later. And hopefully this is rooted. I strive to have this be rooted in Indigenous research methodology, so decolonial approaches as best as we can, to involve things like oral histories, storytelling, lived experiences, things that may not be peer-reviewed and published publicly available, but are still meaningful in the ways that tribes communicate and share that intergenerational knowledge. For folks, a lot of us might know these things, so I might just give this a minute. But some of the barriers to cultural fire include public perception. So many people that at least I know and work with in California have this ingrained fear of fire, whether that's through firsthand experience of loss through wildfire or misplacement or displacement through wildfire. Overall, just the perception of when I say fire stewardship or fire ecology, maybe not to this crowd, the immediate response is fear or negative connection to fire. Smoke concerns, there's a question, someone was interested in learning about cultural fire, the role of smoke, and it's a valid concern. Wildfire produces smoke, controlled and prescribed burns, controlled and prescribed burns emit smoke. So it's a valid concern that the public has, and the public informs representatives for state legislation. So these are all important and interconnected in a lot of different ways. It takes money to have burns, whether that's through a prescribed burn association, a cultural burn demonstration, or some of the agency initiatives. Placing fire is expensive with the gear and the equipment and the permits and the processes. It can be financially burdensome. Some of the policy, land tenure, and regulatory frameworks I went over a little bit. The biggest one, especially coming and learning from folks in California, learning about what federally recognized tribes have access to when it comes to burn permits and access to homelands, and what unrecognized tribes lack access to. So being sure we make space for federally recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes who are both working to bring back their fire stewardship practices. And that kind of blends into treaties that situate tribes on public lands with public access or under the jurisdiction of agency versus private lands. So there's that nuance to fire placement and fire protocols on those different types of lands. Some benefits of cultural fire. Again, this audience might know these things, but some of the observations that tribal members or cultural fire practitioners have seen over time through their fire restoration efforts. The smoke that's emitted from cultural fires has been seen to reduce the amounts of pests, particularly in oak tree stands in California. Some of the observations that I've definitely experienced is that cultural fire, when introduced to areas that have been fire deficient or that are already fire dependent, improves plant health, both with density, so the number of stands that the plant produces, or in the yield, so how tall or how much energy the plant expands to their plant parts. It regenerates plants, recycles nutrients. So I'm interested in the below ground activity, what cultural fire is doing to the soil profile to help rebuild some of those nutrients, water holding capacities that's available for plants, culturally significant plant uptake. Anyone that's been on a burn and has hung out for a day or two after sees ungulates or deers or mule deers or elk coming in and grazing on the fresh green material that's produced. So stick around for a few days or 1 or 2 weeks after burn, and you'll see that wildlife life reintroduced post-fire or following fire. There's been some research that signals the placement of cultural fire or prescribed fire raises the water table or has the soil properties hold on to water more efficiently. So there's positive effects here, especially in drought-laden areas that makes up a lot of California. And the best part about this, some of these things are it contributes to the overall goal that many of us have is reducing fuel loads, reducing instances of large-scale catastrophic wildfire. And then you're looking at a burn on a wetland island at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve. So this was the day of the burn, the cultural fire, excuse me. This was the day of the cultural fire. And the bottom image is 2 days after cultural fire demonstration. So amazing seeing the green come up and just how well it's going to, how well those plants are going to do in response. So the great folks that I worked with, I always have to acknowledge them. So the three main folks that supported some of the questions that I had and being on the land together and placing good fire together was one of the elders, Dana Almendiras, who's Potwin, Southern Wintun, Maidu, Yurok. She works at the Tending and Gathering Garden and reclaiming some of these reclaiming fire practices for some of the culturally significant plants that she, her family, her people use for basketry materials. And the bottom right image is the Honorable Chairman Ron Good, just a wonderful friend and an amazing mentor, leader of the North Fork Mono tribe. His pin is over here, kind of by the foothills of the Sierras. And then the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance, TERRA, who are getting their peoples, the tribal peoples, wildland fire certified, while also working to protect their cultural resources. So these folks are doing amazing work in California and are certainly considered the leaders in this part and kind of across the globe. All right, so I'm gonna try to get through this, but it's a little bit about the research that I was a part of. It was the Indigenous matriarchs that were working to return fire in their homelands. But these are some of the plants that they introduced to me, and all of them are used for their Potwin Southern Wintun basketry materials. And what I found in working in different parts of California was that it wasn't uncommon to revisit these same plant relatives all across California. So many tribes, not all, and I'm not summarizing here, but many tribes use these same 4 plant species for their basketry stewardship. So this top left plant is dogbane, and it is a cordage species. So when it's in good quality, you remove the stick materials, you clean the sticks, and then you weave the cordage materials into nets for hunting and fishing. The right image is a bunch grass, deer grass, and it's used to make some tribes use it to make the beginnings of coil baskets. The bottom left is one of my elders' favorite species. This is tule, and it's used for watercraft. It could be used as a primary food source, just a wonderful plant species that is an indicator species as well. So it's an indicator of ecosystem health, and it grows on wetlands. And then this other species is Western redbud, and the vibrant red coloration is what several tribes used for color dye and basketry materials. So what we did was that we placed culturally led TEK-informed cultural fire to each of these 4 plant stands of species, and we looked at the effects of burned versus unburned areas. And then I am interested in the soils, so we looked at the soil macronutrient levels, soil physical and chemical characteristics, and how long between burning we need to steward these plants. So how long do they go in between burns? So what we found is that traditional basket weavers, the fire keepers, and the tending and gathering garden restoration staff affirmed that cultural fire, improves the quality and the quantity of these basketry materials in both years. So in summation, I'm trying to sum up these 2 points right here. So the quality and the quantity. These plants did better with fire placement compared to no fire placement. And what we also found was that interval cultural burns, slower, lower temperature, lower severity burns, should be applied 1 to 3 years for our forb and our shrub, and every year for the grass and sedge. Climatic change might audit these return intervals, but for now, this is what the elders and basket weavers observed and how often fire needs to be returned to these stands specifically. Okay, happy to answer more questions on that work specifically, but now we'll move over into some of the work that I do now with the Great Plains tribes. And I will say, I do continue with some of the cultural fire initiatives with the practitioners I've met and worked with in California. So I go back and forth quite a bit, being in the Great Plains and then also heading out west as often as I can to keep up with the research, but more importantly, the relationships that were formed and the obligations I have to our elders to return and be a good human, be a good ancestor. So now I'm at the University of Kansas. That kind of story walked us through why I'm here. Actually has a very rich intertribal community. If you've been to Lawrence, Kansas, had family members that went to Haskell, the tribal college there. There's on any given day, there's over 130 different tribal nations that are in our community. So it's a wonderful place to be. And by location, I'm able to mentor and support Indigenous graduate students. So right now in my soil, plant, and fire lab, for the time being, I have 3 graduate students and they're all Native. They're all Native Indigenous graduate students that are working at the intersection of fire, plants, and soils. So it's exciting to be here. Nonetheless, this is the field station, which could be similar to University of California reserve system, so land set aside for ecological research on unceded lands of many nations. So our version of reserve system is the Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, where I now have cultural fire research plots set up on these Kaw Nation lands under the University of Kansas. What I'm interested in, I mentioned this earlier, the tallgrass prairie ecosystem where less than 1% of it remains. I actually work in a place that has some of that 1% that remains. What we're trying to do is, what we have done is set up field trials to see the effects of cultural fire on these remnant remaining prairie stands. So that work is in progress right now. That's one part of what it is that I do. The other part is I've now partnered with some engineers that are interested in building a better fire metric. So how do we take fire from prescribed, controlled, maybe cultural burns that speaks to a better predictor, forecaster of how fast fire will spread and the speed of which and the spread of fire. We don't have a great accessible metric that reads that on prescribed and controlled fire. And we currently have existing metrics on active wildfire, but this open source will help us with obtaining burn permits in a more efficient manner and serve as a better fire forecaster for wildfire. So that's exciting. It's drone work and unidentified aerial flight objects in aerospace engineering. So that's an exciting research thread to be a part of. But when we talk about technology and how fast machine learning is happening, it's important to acknowledge and make space for TEK, indigenous knowledge that has a history of being appropriated, stolen, erased. So when I'm in these conversations about technology in the fire space, we also have to remember that indigenous fire knowledge is data and is deserving of those protections and protocols of TEK. So in thinking through that and working with special editors of the Journal of Wildland Fire, I've created this Indigenous Fire Data Sovereignty. I created it, but hopefully if people have seen it or will read it or have read it, it signals and acknowledges the hard work that my colleagues that are in the fire space, Indigenous fire colleagues that are in the space, cites their work and pulls on the documents that they've created with their tribes and with their partners and their allies. So with this, being in this tech space kind of inspired data sovereignty and protection. And essentially that's what Indigenous data sovereignty, this growing movement right now among younger scholars in developing these frameworks to protect Indigenous knowledge and data. So what this paper does is 3 things, 3 main things that I can share with you today. It acknowledges that Indigenous peoples are data gatherers. It also acknowledges that Indigenous fire knowledge is data and needs to be treated with these fair and care principles when approaching Indigenous peoples with opportunities for fire management and fire research. The other main takeaway from the paper is that the work supports federal codification of provisions specific to cultural and intentional fire, overall. So this pulls on the Wildland Fire Commission's report released by the USDA in 2023. On Fire is what it's called. And we had several Indigenous cultural fire advocates and practitioners on that team of 50 wildland fire professionals that proposed, I think it's 130 different articles into federal legislation, many of them being about cultural fire and knowledge sovereignty. So it's really just amplifying that work that's done by colleagues and putting it into place within the Indigenous data sovereignty realm. Last, it also connects data and policy initiatives in the United States, in First Nations Canada, and with Indigenous peoples striving to return their fire stewardship practices in Australia. So it leans on international law and policy, but makes it opportunities to support fire-specific efforts, education, stewardship in different parts of the world amongst different Indigenous peoples throughout the world. So I hope that's helpful and hope y'all can see this little chart that I have for suggestions of folks that are working with Indigenous nations, whether you're Indigenous yourself or part of tribe, or if you're an allied scholar or in a government agency that's striving to partner with tribes on fire research, how you go about invoking the FAIR principles, FAIR, and specifically the CARE principles, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And what I've learned in giving this talk in interdisciplinary audiences, if they're not in the fire world, you might also think about substituting fire for the research initiatives that you have. So doing research, the research questions are shaped and informed by Indigenous community members, for example, making space for Indigenous worldviews, science, and knowledge transmission in fire or research agenda, and several other initiatives, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So I'll leave this here for a moment. And also there's a QR code in the top right of the screen if you're interested in learning more about Indigenous data sovereignty and specifically Indigenous fire data sovereignty. I hope it's helpful for wildland fire managers, scholars in particular, looking at you allies to implement some of these practices and protocols. And that's all to say that every tribe is different, but hopefully this gives you some beginnings of conversations to have with the tribal members that your work is inviting specifically. All right. So the other document that I have to share is the status of tribes and climate change. And what this is a answer to national climate assessments, which are typically the go-to report for climate research across agencies, across scholars and scholarship. But oftentimes it doesn't include Indigenous peoples within the national climate assessment, nor does it include Indigenous voices. NCA5 did intentionally have a tribes and Indigenous peoples chapter, but for before that, the amount of Indigenous voices of participants was non-existent. What this report tries to do is talk about climate change, both the problems that are happening within our tribal communities, but also the solutions that many of us hold and have always practiced prior to colonization and through when it comes to climate effects. So it's a collection. The chapter that I led and was a part of is the Good Fire and Climate Change, the Return of Indigenous Fire Stewardship Report. It's a collection of cultural fire revitalization examples in Northern California, Southern California, and we're also including Michigan and Wisconsin. So the folks doing the hard work in that part of the country and the world and returning fire, Indigenous fire stewardship. It also talks about tribally led research on the gold-spotted oak borer on the Lochia Indian Reservation, which is great for ecological monitoring, but also protecting a culturally significant plant species, a culturally significant food staple. And it also has a community perspective or community narrative offered through Anishinaabe Cultural Fire in pine forests and their work on fire placement to blueberry stands in that part of the Great Lakes region. So there's another QR code in the bottom left. This was just released, published 2 weeks ago. And I'm excited by it because a lot of people are aware of and amplify the work that's going on in California and the West. So it was a great connector to see other tribes also working on reclaiming their fire stewardship practices in other parts of the United States. So I'm excited by that. All right, so some takeaways that I hopefully have for this talk is on the ecology side, and I think a lot of us know this, myriad landscapes, not just in the United States, but across the world, historically were and presently are fire adapted and fire dependent. Prescribed and cultural fire also builds ecosystem heterogeneity and resilience. I think I'm in the audience that knows this, but those different life stages of vegetation and plants, and also the diversity of plant metrics protects ecosystems, particularly paying close attention to plants that are planted and replanted in the WUI, the wildlife-urban interface. This is a key message that folks that work in Forest Service, for example, and folks that are returning cultural fire work, it's a message that we hope to give to the public. In terms of the cultural component of cultural fire, hopefully as this talk demonstrates and the work that I'm finding is that fire belongs in many of our Indigenous peoples' creation stories, prophecy stories, and stewardship responsibilities. And invoking cultural fire is invoking sovereignty. And the last, in terms of governance, decision-making, Indigenous peoples all across the world are actively revitalizing fire stewardship. They must be involved in fire governance, decision-making, and post-fire ecological monitoring. It's not enough to have cultural fire demonstrations once a year, or as the grants support, short life cycles. It needs to be a continuous reintroduction of cultural fire season after season, between seasons, so that we see the benefits of those culturally significant plants that have returned and safeguarding our homelands or areas that we live in. All right, so I offered a couple of things that I've been working on, both with my colleagues from California, colleagues in the Great Plains, and connections that I'm making abroad. But if you're interested in more, I'll just spend a minute on this. My grad student put this little bookmark together for me, so it's helpful. There's a QR code. Again, it's the same QR code, but I also write about Indigenous people's rights discourse. I didn't quite have a moment to talk about this in great length, but this pulls on and it amplifies some of the statements that my colleagues working in Indigenous Cultural Fire have made, that it's an invocation of UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, international protocol that should be enforced by law, but is not in many parts of the world. So this paper concentrates on how Indigenous Cultural Fire return is an invocation of UNDRIP, along with several other international policies as case examples. So if you want to learn about Indigenous fire justice is kind of how I framed it. It's enveloped in this Indigenous people's rights discourse towards hemispheric Indigenous climate and environmental justice. Myself and a couple of other cultural fire colleagues wrote a piece on fire, but it's a collection of Indigenous governance and natural resources. So that's evolving wildlife management, cultures of governance through Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. So that's a great one for some examples all throughout the United States, but our part focused on cultural fire return. Some people have heard of this in the terms that are linked with the cultural fire initiatives in the Yosemite area with Chairman Ron Good. We write about solastalgia or climate grief that you all, younger people, are experiencing more so than older generations. So that solastalgia, eco-anxiety. And we present, myself, Chairman Ron Good, and Dr. Erica Tom, the co-authors, present cultural fire as solophilia. So the care that you have for a place and mitigating some of those climate anxiety experiences. And the last, this book just came out. It's a collection of 50 Indigenous scientists that are working on lots of different realms of science and how we're reclaiming that space through our Indigenous worldview, intergenerational knowledge systems. So that's a book. It's called Critical Reflections on Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And the chapter that I have is about honoring our responsibilities doing science. It's now available. It says available March 25th, but it's out now if you want to add it to your collection. I have one more slide, Matt, sorry about that. So that's my contact information as well. Ways to support. So again, I'm not speaking for anybody. I'm just kind of offering my experience in being in this space as an Indigenous woman, cultural fire practitioner doing this work. So some folks that you can support. We'll start more locally. The Cultural Fire Management Council in Northwest corner of California doing amazing work, holding Trex exchanges, leading the way, and a lot of cultural fire return initiatives. So have the opportunity to support the Cultural Fire Management Council. Also the Fire Generation Collaborative, a collection of younger Indigenous peoples working on policy invocation to protect old growth forests and to get more Indigenous-led cultural fire on the ground. First Nations FNES, First Nations Emergency Services Society in British Columbia, Canada, doing some amazing work, also returning cultural fire in that province up north. And one of the practitioners made me aware of this, so this is one way folks can help. Going back to the conversation about federally recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes, for the unrecognized tribes that have the desire to be federally recognized, they have active petitions to obtain. It's one part of obtaining their federally recognized status. So there is a way to support tribes that have those petitions in queue. So there's a website here to sign a petition to support the tribe's invocation of a federally recognized status. Okay, I'll put the bookmark back up. But with that, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions after I stop here. But we say in my language, Ashont, all good things. Thank you.